Okay, let's unpack this deep dive into a truly disturbing chapter of history. Today, we're taking a stack of sources on a figure known by some pretty chilling nicknames. The Butcher of Hanover, the Vampire of Hanover, and the Wolfman.
Yeah, we're talking about Fritz Haarmann.
Fritz Haarmann, exactly. His crimes span the years between, 1918 and 1924.
That's right. And claimed the lives of at least 24 young men and boys, possibly more.
At least 24. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it's crucial to understand the backdrop, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. This wasn't just happening anywhere. It was post-World War I Germany, specifically the chaotic early years of the Weimar Republic.
Right, so think significant upheaval.
Widespread poverty, rampant crime, a booming black market, a real breakdown of order.
The kind of breakdown where someone like Harmon could, well, operate for a time with terrifying impunity.
Terrifying is the word.
Exactly. So our mission with this deep dive is to take the sources you provided and, use them to piece together the story. Who Harmon was, how he managed to operate for so long in that environment.
Yeah, and the ripple effects. The impact of his horrific crimes.
Yeah, we're here to pull out the most important and, frankly, often the most surprising nuggets of knowledge along the way, trying to guide you through this difficult material.
It's a grim subject, no doubt about it, but the sources offer crucial insights, not just into the anatomy of a serial killer, but maybe the societal failures that allowed him to operate.
Yeah, the conditions that let it happen. So here's where it gets really interesting. Let's start by setting that scene more fully, the chaos of post-WWI Germany, and then look at Harmon's own troubled background. Because the sources tell us his path towards criminality was laid incredibly early.
It really was.
What does his early life story reveal?
Well, what's fascinating here is how early and how consistently trouble seemed to follow him. Born in Hanover, 1879, youngest of 6.
Youngest child, okay.
And the sources describe him as a quiet child, few friends, showing behaviors considered effeminate back then, playing with dolls, passionate about needlework, apparently.
And the family life sounds challenging.
Particularly challenging, yeah. You mentioned the father, authoritarian, a womanizer, contracted syphilis.
Right, but juxtaposed with a really doting mother who seemed to spoil him.
Spoiled the youngest, yeah. And the parents stayed together despite the father's affairs. There's also that deeply unsettling detail mentioned in the sources.
The alleged molestation incident at age 8.
Exactly. Something he apparently never discussed in detail later.
Wow. And school.
Not great. Noted as spoiled, prone to daydreaming, below average academically, repeated years.
So, not thriving there, he left school at 15.
Yeah. 1894, brief apprenticeship, then tried a military academy in 1895.
Military academy, how did that go?
Well, despite maybe being physically strong later, his early work attempts didn't really stick. The military service is interesting, though. He did compulsory service again around 1900. And the sources say he actually performed well initially. Excellent marksman. He even called it his happiest time.
Happiest time. But something went wrong.
Yeah, his service was cut short, twice, actually, by these periodic lapses of consciousness. Sort of like blackouts.
Lapses of consciousness?
Yeah.
So, medical issues.
Diagnosed back then as equivalent to epilepsy, led to his discharge in 1895. Then later, after the compulsory service stint, similar issues, he collapsed, dizzy spells, hospitalized, deemed unsuitable for service and work. Medically discharged again in 1902. The diagnosis then was probable dementia precox.
Dementia precox.
Yeah.
That was an early term for something like schizophrenia, wasn't it?
Kind of along those lines, yeah. He got a small monthly pension after that second discharge.
Okay, so medical discharge, a small pension. But even before all that fully derailed him, the trouble with the law had already started.
Oh, yeah. Incredibly young. At just 16, back in 1896, first arrest. Sexual offenses involving young boys, luring them to cellars.
16.
And following more offenses, the system did try to step in. In 1897, he was placed in a mental institution.
An institution? On what grounds?
Certified as incurably deranged and unfit to stand trial, the idea was indefinite confinement.
Incurably deranged, and yet...
And yet he escaped just a year later. Jan 1898, fled to Switzerland, apparently with his mother's help.
His mother helped him escape.
Seems like it. Lived with a relative there, did handyman work, but he returned to Hanover by April 1899.
So he's back. What then?
Well, he even got engaged around 1900. To an Erna Lowert, she apparently became pregnant, though it was later aborted.
Engagement? That seems almost normal, comparatively.
It's a strange period. He briefly worked in his father's cigar factory again, got into lawsuits with his father over money, death threats apparently. A psychiatric exam in 1903 judged him morally inferior, but not, mentally unstable enough for confinement again.
So not legally insane, but clearly deeply troubled.
Deeply. He and his fiancée tried opening a fishmongery with his dad's money, but that failed. He was classified as disabled, unable to work in 1904. His pension increased slightly.
And the engagement?
Ended that same year. He accused her of an affair, she kicked him out, and from about 1904 onward, the sources just paint this picture.
Petty crime.
Pretty much exclusively. Petty thief, burglar, con artist. Sometimes he'd take legitimate work but end up stealing. There are even claims of grave robbing between 1905 and 1913, though he was never charged for that.
Grave robbing.
Yeah. He spent the majority of 1905 to 1912 in jail for various things, then arrested for burglary again in 1913. They found a hoard of stolen stuff, convicted, sentenced to 5 years.
5 years, which takes us right up to
his release in April 1918, just as World War I is ending.
Right into that post-war chaos you mentioned earlier. He gets out, moves back to Hanover.
And the sources say he was really struck by the national poverty, the desperation everywhere.
And did he try to go straight?
Doesn't seem like it for long. He pretty quickly reestablished criminal contacts, especially around Hanover Central Station. Trading in contraband, stolen property.
Okay, Hanover Central Station. That becomes important, doesn't it?
Hugely important. And this is where the story takes, really unique and frankly deeply disturbing turn. The police knew him.
They knew his record.
Oh, yeah. They knew about the theft, the fraud, the sexual offenses. They also knew he was homosexual, which was illegal then, punishable by imprisonment.
Illegal and punishable? And yet
somehow, he starts building this relationship with them.
With the police. How? Why?
He became an informant. The sources pinpoint this starting around 1919.
An informant. Okay, so was it just about avoiding getting caught for his own stuff?
That was part of it, definitely.
Yeah.
A way to divert police attention. But the sources suggest something much more chilling.
What's that?
They suggest it was a calculated move, not just self-preservation, but specifically to make it easier for him to access young males.
Access? You mean potential victims?
Well, that seems to be the implication. This informant role gave him this incredible level of freedom and even trust from the police.
Trust? I don't get it. He's a known criminal, priors for sexual offenses. How could the police trust him?
It sounds completely backwards, I know. But the sources detailed this specific ruse he used.
Go on.
He'd tell the police he'd arranged to fence stolen goods for other criminals at his place. Then the police would raid at a prearranged time, catch the other guys red-handed.
So he sets them up.
Exactly. And sometimes Haarmann would even get arrested alongside them, just to keep up appearances, avoid suspicion from the underworld.
Maintaining his cover.
Yeah. And he'd also perform these sort of citizens' arrests at the station, nabbing commuters with forged documents, things like that, handing them over to the police.
So he looked useful. Proactive, even.
The police came to see him as a useful tool. A reliable source, is how the sources put it.
A reliable source.
Yeah.
And the consequence of that reliability.
Was that they essentially gave him carte blanche to patrol Hanover Station whenever he wanted. Free reign.
The very place.
The very place where he would find most of his victims. It created the perfect cover. A terrifying shield of legitimacy given to him by the authorities themselves.
Right in the middle of this busy station full of vulnerable young people. Runaways, people looking for work.
Exactly. And that's the environment, the cover story, under which this horrific murder spree unfolded between 1918 and 1924.
The scale is just staggering. You said at least 24 confirmed murders.
At least 24 confirmed. Many suspect the real number could be significantly higher, maybe 27 minimum, possibly many more based on his later claims.
And all victims were young males.
All young males, yes. Ages ranging from 10 to 22, but the majority were teenagers.
And he found them primarily at the station.
Mostly, yeah. Commuters, runaways, kids new to the city looking lost, sometimes male prostitutes who frequented the area.
And how did he lure them away? Using that police connection.
Often, yes. Or just promises of help, a place to stay, maybe work, sometimes using the threat of a false arrest. He'd take them back to one of the 3 apartments he lived in during those years.
Sellerstrasse, Neustrasse, Rotrey. The sources list them.
That's right.
And the method of murder. It's particularly brutal. and distinctive.
It is, extremely. Once the victim was at his apartment, usually after he'd offered them food or drink,
Yeah.
the sources describe him biting into, or sometimes through, the victim's Adam's apple, while also strangling them manually. He chillingly called this his love bite. It caused asphyxiation or sometimes severed the trachea.
My God. And then...
He often collapsed onto the body afterwards, apparently. Then came the dismemberment.
Right. The sources give incredibly difficult, graphic details about this process.
They do. It's hard reading. Haarmann himself claimed it was extremely unpleasant, said he felt ill for 8 days after the first murder.
But he kept doing it.
He claimed the passion he felt during the killing itself was stronger than the horror of the cutting and the chopping, as he put it.
How long did that part take?
It could take up to 2 days to fully dismember a body. The descriptions involve fortifying himself with black coffee, covering the victim's face.
Okay, we don't need all the specifics, but knives, breaking bones.
Removing organs, paring flesh from bones, dealing with the head last, using an axe sometimes to splinter the skull and bones. It was methodical and gruesome.
And disposal. Where did the remains end up?
Mostly, he discarded the dismembered remains in the Lane River, which flows through Hanover. The very first victim, Roth, he apparently buried initially, and the last known victim, De Vries, was thrown into a lake near the Herrenhausen Gardens.
What about their belongings? Clothes, possessions?
He'd keep some for himself, or for his accomplice, Hans Grans, who we'll get to. He'd sell other items on the black market, sometimes even to legitimate secondhand shops, or just give them away as gifts to acquaintances.
Which later became evidence, presumably. Now let's address one of the most infamous, stomach-churning rumors about this case. The idea that he ate his victim's flesh or sold it as meat. What did the sources actually say?
Right. This is a really complex and horrifying point. The sources are clear. No evidence confirmed that he ate human flesh or specifically sold it as pork or horse meat, despite the nicknames like Butcher.
But the rumors were incredibly persistent.
Incredibly. And they weren't entirely baseless in terms of his activities. The sources do confirm he traded extensively in contraband meat, boneless, diced, ground meat.
But where did that meat come from?
He claimed he got it from a supplier named Carl. Very vague. But neighbors later testified about him constantly boiling large pots of meat, straining fat, giving them sausages that sometimes made them ill.
That sounds suspicious on its own.
Extremely. And there's one really chilling account from a neighbor who claimed she saw what looked like a human mouth boiling in his kettle. Police at the time dismissed it, saying it must have been a pig snout.
Wow. So whether technically proven or not regarding cannibalism, his meat trading activities and the neighbor accounts definitely fueled those terrifying rumors.
Absolutely. It created this aura of almost unimaginable horror around him.
Let's go back to the beginning of the murders. The first known victim, Friedel Roth, 17 years old, disappeared in 1918. And what's incredible, almost unbelievable, police were actually looking for Roth when they raided Haarmann's apartment that same year.
That's one of those truly frustrating near misses in the case, isn't it? Police raided his place, Sellerstrasse, in October 1918. They were looking for Roth.
And what did they find?
They didn't find Roth. They found Haarmann with a semi-naked 13-year-old boy.
So they arrested him for that?
Yes, charged with sexual assault and battery of a minor. He was eventually sentenced to 9 months, but didn't actually serve the time until 1920 for various reasons.
But the truly horrifying part.
Haarmann later confessed that during that 1918 police search, Friedel Roth's severed head was hidden behind his stove in the room while the police were there.
He was literally hiding evidence of murder while police were searching his apartment regarding that very missing person. Unbelievable. And it was around this time, while he was sort of dodging serving that sentence, that he met Hans Grans.
Exactly. Met him in October 1919 at the Hanover station again. Hans Grans was an 18-year-old runaway from Berlin, been sleeping rough, selling his clothes to survive.
And how did they connect?
Haarmann claimed Grans actually initiated contact, said Grans had heard about Haarmann's homosexuality and intended to prostitute himself. We only have Haarmann's word for that initial encounter, of course.
Haarmann's view of Grans, according to the sources, it seems really warped.
Deeply twisted, yeah. He claimed he saw Grans like a son, said he pulled him out of the ditch, but at the same time, he clearly became completely smitten with him. Infatuated.
And Grans became
his lover. And his criminal accomplice, involved in selling the victim's belongings.
But the relationship sounds volatile.
Very. Haarmann became aware, or at least believed, that Grans manipulated him, mocked him behind his back. He apparently evicted Grand several times after arguments, but then would plead for him to come back.
Why tolerate that?
Harmon himself said it was because he craved Grand's companionship so desperately. His quote was something like, "I had to have someone I meant everything to, even if that meaning was built on something dark."
And the sources detail instances where Grand's alleged involvement might have gone beyond just fencing stolen goods.
Yes, potentially into the murders themselves, or at least knowledge of them.
Like with Fritz Frank.
Right, a victim from 1923. Grand's allegedly whispered something chilling to female acquaintances. "Hey, he's going to be trampled on today," referring to Frank.
Yeah.
Harmon also claimed Grand's saw Frank's nude, dead body in the apartment and just asked, "When shall I come back again?"
Just completely cold.
If Herman's account is true, then there's Adolf Hennies, another 1923 victim. Herman actually denied killing Hennies, but admitted dismembering him. He claimed he came home and found the body, minus the love bite, and Grand's and another associate just said, "One of yours."
Grand's denied that.
Completely. And because of the conflicting testimony, neither Harmon nor Grand's was ultimately convicted for Hennies' murder specifically.
But there were cases where Haarmann directly implicated Grand's as inciting murder.
Yes. Adolf Hannibal, also 1923. Harmon claimed he killed Hannibal upon Grand's insistence, and witnesses corroborated seeing Grant pointing Hannibal out to Harmon at the station shortly before he disappeared.
That sounds more concrete.
It was. That testimony was a key basis for Grand's initial death sentence for incitement. And then Fritz Wittig in 1924. Herman claimed he killed Wittig because Grand's coveted the young man's suit.
Coveted his suit.
Yeah. And crucially, police found a handwritten note, dated the day Wittig vanished, signed by both Harmon and Grand's, where Grand's agreed to pay Harmon 20 gold marks for that specific suit.
Wow. That's pretty damning evidence of complicity, at least after the fact, maybe even planning.
It was certainly interpreted that way. That note was central to Grand's conviction as an accessory in Wittig's murder. It paints a picture of Grand's being potentially much more involved, maybe even instigating sometimes, not just a passive recipient of stolen goods.
It also adds another layer to their dynamic. Harmon needing Grand's potentially exploiting that need, maybe even for murderous ends. It's complex and dark.
Extremely. And it highlights how Harmon might have even tried to manipulate the situation later. Grand's had a criminal record too and was actually in custody when another suspected victim, Hans Kimes, disappeared in 1922. Harmon later tried to frame Grand's for that murder, possibly in revenge for Grand's stealing from him.
So years of this going on, murders, dismemberment, the strange relationship with Grand's, the police connection. How did it finally unravel?
It wasn't until May 1924 that the physical evidence really started surfacing in a way that couldn't be ignored, almost 6 years after the first known murder.
What happened in May 24?
Children playing near the Line River found a human skull, May 17th. Then, less than 2 weeks later, May 29th, a second skull was found nearby. Then in early June, someone found a sack filled with bones.
Oh, wow. Skulls and bones appearing in the river.
Exactly. And then on June 13th, more skulls were found. And these weren't just old bones. Forensic examination showed evidence of knife wounds, signs of scalping on some, and clear indications they'd been severed from the vertebrae.
Professionally, almost clinically dismembered.
Precisely. And these discoveries were happening against this backdrop of growing public anxiety in Hanover.
About missing people.
Yes. Rumors were swirling. The number of missing teenage boys and young men was alarmingly high. Sources mention almost 600 reported missing in Hanover in 1923 alone.
600 in 1 year.
That's the figure cited. Newspapers had already started picking up on it, highlighting disappearances stretching back to 1918. The public was getting scared, connecting the dots maybe faster than the police were or were willing to.
So the public got involved in the search.
They did. On June 8th, hundreds of residents apparently organized their own searches along the riverbanks. They found more bones, fragments of bodies, and handed them over to the police.
That must have forced the police to take it seriously.
It seems so. At that point, they decided to officially drag the river.
And what did they find then?
The true horrifying scale. Over 500 human bones and body sections were recovered from the lane.
500 pieces.
Yeah. Many showed knife striations, clear marks of dissection at the joints. The court doctor confirmed they belonged to at least 22 different individuals. Some remains looked fresh, others were much older.
And the victim's profile?
Consistent. Over 30% were identified as belonging to males aged between 15 and 20.
Okay, so now they have bodies, multiple victims, all young men dismembered. Suspicion must have fallen on Haarmann pretty quickly then.
You'd think so, and it did. He was known to the police, obviously. His 15 prior convictions, including child molestation, sexual assault, his known homosexuality.
And he was already linked to those 1918 disappearances, Roth and another boy, Herman Kusch.
Exactly. His record, his known hangouts at the station, his previous connection to missing boys. He was the prime suspect.
So they watched him.
They placed him under surveillance, starting June 18th, 1924. But here's an interesting detail, because Haarmann knew so many of the local Hanover officers because of his informant work.
They couldn't use local cops.
Right. They brought in 2 undercover officers from Berlin, specifically so he wouldn't recognize them.
Smart move. Did it work?
Almost immediately. Just 4 days later, June 22nd, the undercover officers observed him at the station arguing loudly with a 15-year-old boy named Karl Frum.
Okay.
And then, incredibly, Haarmann does what he always did. He goes to the regular police and asks them to arrest Frum, claiming the boy had forged documents or something, using his old informant playbook.
He tried the same trick again, while under surveillance for mass murder.
The audacity is something else, but this time it backfired spectacularly.
Oh.
When the regular police arrested Frum and questioned him, the boy told them everything. He said he'd been living with Haarmann for the past 4 days, and that Haarmann had repeatedly raped him, holding a knife to his throat.
Oh my God. That was it then.
That was the final piece they needed. Haarmann was arrested the very next morning, June 23rd. Initially, the charge was sexual assault based on Frum's testimony.
And the apartment search, what did they find at Rote?
Exactly what you'd fear. Extensively blood-stained floorboards, walls, bedding, just soaked in it.
What was his explanation for that?
His initial excuse, illegal meat trading, said he'd been butchering animals there.
Which, as we know, he was involved in trading meat.
Right, so it wasn't a completely outlandish excuse on the surface, but then the witness accounts started flooding in.
Neighbors. Acquaintances.
Yes. People questioned by police commented on the sheer number of teenage boys seen visiting Haarmann's apartment over the years. Many also reported seeing Haarmann leaving late at night or early in the morning, carrying concealed sacks or heavy bags.
And dumping them.
2 former tenants even testified they'd gotten suspicious back in the spring of 1924. They followed him one night and actually saw him discard a heavy sack into the Lenine River.
They saw him do it.
They did. Then came the victim's possessions. Police confiscated clothes and other items found in his apartment or items he'd given to acquaintances. They put them on public display at the police station.
For families to identify.
Exactly. And families of missing youth started recognizing things, despite Haarmann trying to claim he just traded in used clothes or that items were from consensual encounters.
Was there one specific item, one victim, that broke the case wide open?
Yes. The turning point, according to the sources, was the positive identification of items belonging to Robert Witzel, an 18-year-old who had gone missing.
What items?
His clothes, his boots, even his keys were found and identified by his family. And crucially, one of the skulls found in the river back in May was then definitively identified as Witzel's.
Okay, physical remains linked to specific possessions.
And the final nail. Witzel's friend came forward and identified Haarmann as the man Witzel was last seen with. Crucially, the friend thought Haarmann was a plainclothes police officer at the time.
Because Haarmann played that role so well. So, faced with all that, Witzel's items, the skull, the witness ID, his landlady apparently having Witzel's jacket.
He broke down. Confronted with the concrete evidence linking him directly to a specific, now identified murder victim, the denials collapsed. His sister apparently urged him to confess.
And he did.
He confessed. He admitted to raping, killing, and dismembering numerous young men between 1918 and 1924.
What reason did he give? Did he explain why?
He described it as a kind of rabid sexual passion. He claimed he never actually intended to murder anyone beforehand, but that in the moment of sexual ecstasy, he was seized by this irresistible urge to bite the Adam's apple. He even mentioned one intended victim who managed to escape after he attacked him.
An irresistible urge. But investigators had doubts about the lack of premeditation, didn't they?
They did. They noted he only seemed to confess clearly to the murders where they already had strong evidence against him. And they pointed to circumstantial evidence suggesting premeditation, like the way he concocted explanations for boys' disappearances or actively dissuaded parents or friends from reporting them missing.
Right, protecting his operation.
Exactly. And then there were his chilling, vague statements about the total number of victims.
Saying it was higher.
Much higher than the 27 he was eventually charged with. He threw out numbers like 30, 40, at one point even suggested 50 to 70, and he made that incredibly disturbing comment. There are some victims you don't know about, but it's not those you think. almost playing games with them.
Just horrific. So the confession leads to the trial. When did that happen?
The trial of both Fritz Haarmann and Hans Granz began relatively quickly on December 4th, 1924.
Granz was arrested later.
Yes, Granz was arrested on July 8th and charged as an accessory to murder. Haarmann faced 27 counts of murder.
Haarmann defended himself.
Insisted on it, yes, conducting his own defense.
How did he plead to the 27 counts?
It was mixed. He acknowledged guilt for 14 murders, claimed uncertainty about 13 others, and flat out denied killing 3 of them.
And Granz
Pleaded not guilty to the accessory charges.
What was the atmosphere like at the trial?
It was a media sensation. Huge. One of the first really major modern crime media events in Germany. International press covered it extensively.
Those nicknames, Butcher, Vampire, Wolfman, they probably came from the headlines.
Almost certainly. The press latched on to the gruesome details. It got so intense, apparently, with the carnal and gruesome revelations that the judge excluded spectators from the 3rd day onwards.
Understandable. How did Haarmann behave in court?
He stuck to his story about lacking premeditation, calling the reason for the killings a mystery. He confessed again to the 14 he admitted to, and to keeping or selling their possessions.
Did he address the meat-selling rumors?
He denied it again. Denied selling body parts as meat. And interestingly, a medical expert testified that analysis of meat found in his apartment didn't definitively point to human remains, which supported Haarmann's denial on that specific point, at least in court.
How did he react to evidence, like photos of victims?
Reports say he was often taciturn, almost dismissive. Looking at photos, he might say things like, "I probably killed him," or if they proved he had the victim's belongings, "Charge it to me." Just matter of fact.
Chillingly detached.
Very. He also insisted most of the skulls found in the lane weren't his victims, because he claimed he almost always smashed the skulls completely, except for one undamaged one, which he admitted might be his.
What physical evidence was presented?
The skeletal remains, obviously. Skulls, thigh bones, the bucket he allegedly used during dismemberment, the blood-soaked bed from his apartment.
And witness testimony. Neighbors, associates.
Lots of witnesses. Acquaintances, other criminals testified. Neighbors repeated their stories, buying meat from him, the boiling pots, that incident with the alleged mouth in the kettle, which police had dismissed. People testified about the constant stream of youths visiting and often not leaving.
Did anyone have an explanation for where the boys went?
Apparently, Haarmann sometimes spun a tale about them joining the French Foreign Legion to explain their sudden absence. Neighbors also recounted seeing him take sacks to the river. The landlady testified about the meat boiling, the strained fat, getting sick from his sausages.
And the police role. Did that come under scrutiny?
Absolutely. Testimony revealed just how much the police had known about Haarmann's activities after his 1918 release. His informant status, his presence at the station.
But they hadn't suspected him for the recent wave of missing boys.
Apparently not seriously, despite his record, despite witnesses placing him with some victims shortly before they vanished. It highlighted a massive failure of investigation, or at least connection-making, until the bodies literally started floating out.
He was acquitted of 3 murders, though, despite denying them.
Yes, he was acquitted for the murders of Wolf, Hennies, and Bach. The sources suggest reasons like conflicting testimony, especially in the Hennies case involving Granz, or perhaps lack of specific evidence directly refuting his passion defense for those particular instances, even with strong circumstantial links.
How long did the trial last?
Incredibly short, considering the scope. Barely 2 weeks. 190 witnesses testified in that time.
And the verdict?
Came on December 19th, 1924. Haarmann was judged sane and legally accountable for his actions. Found guilty of 24 of the 27 murders.
Guilty of 24 murders. The sentence?
Death by beheading.
How did Haarmann react to the death sentence?
Eerily composed, almost cheerful, according to reports. He accepted the verdict fully and freely, said he would go joyfully and happily, comparing it to a wedding. He made a statement. "Condemn me to death. I ask only for justice. I am not mad."
Just bizarre acceptance. What about Granz?
Granz was found guilty of incitement to murder in the Handel case and accessory to murder in the Wittig case, based largely on Haarmann's testimony and that note about the suit.
And his sentence?
Also, death by beheading for the incitement charge, plus 12 years imprisonment for the accessory charge, running concurrently effectively.
How did Granz react?
Completely the opposite of Haarmann. Became hysterical, apparently collapsed when the verdict was read.
Did they appeal?
Haarmann made no appeal. He claimed death would be his atonement and chillingly added he would probably kill again if he were ever free.
He knew he couldn't stop.
It seemed that way. Granz, however, did lodge an appeal, but it was rejected in February 1925.
So the execution went ahead.
For Haarmann, yes. On April 15, 1925, he was beheaded by guillotine executioner Karl Gruppler in the grounds of Hanover Prison.
Was he given notice?
Only informed the evening before. He spent time in prayer with a pastor, was granted final wishes, an expensive cigar, and Brazilian coffee.
Who witnessed it?
Very limited witnesses. Crucially, no press were allowed. His demeanor was described as pale and nervous, but he tried to maintain his bravado.
Did he have any last words?
Sources record him saying things like, "I am guilty, I want to die as a man, and I repent, but I do not fear death."
And that was the end of Fritz Haarmann, but not the end of the story or the questions.
Not at all. The true victim count remains unknown. His claims varied so wildly, 30, 40, maybe up to 70. Cases like Hermann Koch from 1918 or Hans Kimes from 1922, where evidence pointed strongly towards Haarmann, like a handkerchief with Granz's name found near Kimes's body, were never officially solved or tried.
What happened to Haarmann's body? Or parts of it?
Disturbingly, sections of his brain were removed right after execution for analysis. They apparently found traces of meningitis, but it wasn't preserved long-term. His head, however, his head was preserved in formaldehyde. It was kept in a medical school in Göttingen for study for decades.
For decades? Seriously?
Until 2014. Only then was it finally cremated and disposed of anonymously.
Wow. And the victims, what about their remains?
The recovered remains, the bones found in the lane, were buried together in a communal grave at Spökener Cemetery in Hanover in February 1925. A granite memorial stone was erected there in April 1928, listing the known victims' names and ages.
A small measure of dignity, at least. Now, Granz didn't hang, did he? His story continued.
It did. There was a significant twist. After Haarmann's execution, a letter surfaced, written by Haarmann in February 1925, addressed to Granz's father.
What did it say?
Haarmann claimed Granz was completely innocent, knew nothing about the murders, and that any accusations Haarmann had made against him were done under duress or out of revenge.
Haarmann recanted his testimony against Granz, after Granz was sentenced to death based on it.
Essentially, yes. This letter led to Granz being granted a second trial, which took place in January 1926.
And the outcome of the retrial.
With Haarmann dead and his testimony now contradicted by his own letter, the case against Granz was weaker. He was found guilty of the lesser charges of aiding and abetting in the Hannapel and Wittig murders.
So no death penalty?
No, he received 2 concurrent 12-year prison sentences instead.
What happened to Granz after prison?
He served his time. But then, in a dark turn typical of the era that followed, he was extra-legally interned in the Sachsenhausen concentration camp by the Nazis.
Why? Just because of his association with Haarmann? Or his homosexuality?
The sources don't specify the exact reason for that internment, but given the Nazi persecution of homosexuals and asocials, it's highly likely related to his past. He remained there until the camp was liberated in April 1945.
He survived Sachsenhausen.
He did. He apparently returned to Hanover and lived there until his death in 1975. A long and complicated life after his association with Haarmann.
That's incredible. Beyond the individuals involved, what was the broader impact of the Haarmann case on German society at the time?
It was huge. It stirred up intense discussion and debate on several fronts. Police investigation methods came under fire, obviously. The treatment of the mentally ill was questioned. The validity of the death penalty itself was debated.
And the issue of homosexuality.
That became arguably the most heated topic, as the sources highlight. Homosexuality was illegal, remember, criminalized under paragraph 175.
So Haarmann being homosexual.
The horrific nature of his crimes, committed by a known homosexual man who preyed on young men, fueled intense homophobia across Germany. It caused splits within the already fragile gay rights movement of the Weimar era.
How so?
Some tried to distance the movement from Haarmann, others found themselves on the defensive. It basically provided, as one source puts it, new fodder for conservative adversaries of legal sex reform. It was a major setback. This historical context is really important for understanding the climate.
Yeah, using the crimes of one individual to demonize an entire group. Sadly familiar. Did the case influence culture? Movies, books?
Definitely. Most famously, it was a major inspiration for Fritz Lang's absolutely chilling 1931 film M.
M wasn't directly about Haarmann, though, was it?
Yeah. Not directly, no. Peter Lorre's character was more of a composite, inspired by Haarmann, but also other serial killers active in Germany around that time, like Peter Kürten. But the atmosphere, the public fear, the police investigation, a lot of that echoes the Haarmann case.
Were there more direct adaptations?
Yes, later on. The Tenderness of the Wolves from 1973 is directly based on Haarmann, with Kurt Rabe playing him. Then Der Todmacher, The Deathmaker, in 1995, which focused on the psychiatric examinations. And even more recently, elements apparently loosely inspired the film Cyrus, Mind of a Serial Killer in 2010, mixing Haarmann with Henry Lee Lucas.
So his shadow looms large in that genre. Okay, so just to recap, we've taken this deep dive into the sheer horror and, frankly, the scale of Fritz Haarmann's crimes. 6 years post-WWI Hanover, at least 24 young lives brutally taken.
And we've pulled out some incredibly unsettling insights from the sources. The way he lived, that double life killer and trusted police informant, it's almost unbelievable.
The sheer duration of his crimes going undetected. And the deeply troubling failure of the system, particularly the police, to connect those dots much, much earlier, despite all the suspicious, despite his record.
Yeah, and what's fascinating in a horrifying way is how the unique conditions of the time, the chaos, the poverty, the social breakdown of the early Weimar Republic,
Combined with existing prejudice.
exactly, and significant blind spots within institutions like the police, how all that created this perfect storm, an environment that allowed a figure like Haarmann not just to exist, but to thrive undetected for so long. He effectively used the very system designed to catch criminals as his shield.
Which really raises that important question. Given all that the societal upheaval, the widespread fear, the pre-existing prejudices, was the system at the time truly equipped to deal with a killer like Haarmann? Or were there deeper societal blind spots at play?
Was the system simply unwilling or unable to see what was happening, especially when it involved vulnerable populations like runaways or touched on uncomfortable truths like the interception of horrific crime and illegal homosexuality? It makes you wonder.
It does. And maybe a final thought for you, the listener, to consider from all this.
Think about the implications. A known criminal, deeply embedded within law enforcement activities, so much so that it not only shields him, but actively enables his crimes. What does that suggest about the potential blind spots of institutions, maybe even today, when they're faced with complex social issues or inconvenient truths that challenge their assumptions, their priorities, or just make them uncomfortable?